Thanks so much. I hang out with large numbers of different people in the room, but in particular, this work is joint with the organizer, who I apologize I left off one character. Yeah. So so I have the honor of following two titans. But that is also a very difficult honor, so I'm going to try and differentiate myself on the one. I can't differentiate on quality because they're just going to win. So I'm going to attempt to differentiate on total number of open questions. So there will be more things that we haven't solved yet. Simple starting story. We're going to think about holdout as a problem for market design. We're going to be thinking about situations where holdout occurs in assembly of complementary goods, so things like plots of land. And we're trying to understand how we might do economic design to reduce holdout. But first, what are we talking about? Let's imagine that 10 farmers own privately valued farms. And we know, we will lift the veil of ignorance for a moment and learn their true values. So their values are 2, 3, 4 through 10. And then the last guy over here on the right has value 1. Return the veil of ignorance, though. You want to buy the farms and build an airfield, which to you is worth 90. So there's a huge expected, positive social return from building the airfield, right? The expected total value is 55 because we're imagining, say, that the farmers' values are uniformly drawn 1 through 10. That's consistent with the example I gave you. But you don't know whose farmers' values are which. So what do you do? So option 1 is that you could make sort of specific take it or leave it offers. You sort of say, okay, there's got to be a guy with value 1 and value 2 and through 10. Let's make an offer, randomly allocate offers of that type to different guys. And that's not going to work. So Drew is shaking his head, right? So Mr. 1 gets this huge windfall. Hi, Mr. 1, would you like 10 for your farm? He says, great. And these other guys all say, no, you're not offering me enough. And so your probability of sale, you have to match up exactly your probabilities. Actually, it's even lower than that, I suppose, because you're also you should also conditioning on there being exactly one guy of each type. But so it's tiny. You can't do that. Option 2 is you could make a uniform take it or leave it offer to everybody. So suppose you offer everyone 8. You're giving away almost all of the surplus, or all of your surplus from the sale. But still, the probability of sale is actually quite low, right? And that here, it's legitimate. There are some guys in the market somewhere that have high values, and the asymmetric information means that you don't know who they are. So another option is you just go to ask every farmer. So how much would you like to sell your land to me? But there's a huge free rider problem. They're all going to say, oh, mine's worth 10. Then you can't quite make the project happen. And so in practice, what a lot of governments have done as a solution for these collective assemblies is what's called eminent domain. The government just takes the land and pays each farmer, some assessed market value, which in practice a lot of the times, either through legitimate assessments or through, through some form of corruption, has been assessed as sort of the minimal possible market value for the land. And the minimum possible market value for the land often falls precipitously when an eminent domain action is announced. Because the government will say, oh, this area is blighted, we're going to tear everything down and build some new economic development center, so this is junky land, it's not worth very much anymore. So in practice, it doesn't feel like a great solution, but we have this problem that both, if we ask every farmer to reveal his value, he's going to hold out for a lot. And similarly, if we sort of make a uniform offer, there are some farmers who are in some sense legitimate holdouts, people whose values truly are higher than that, we're offering. Yes? Yeah?
Is that real?
Is this real?
No, is it real that property values drop deliberately assessed property values drop before eminent domain?
Yes, so governments actually do sometimes do things that change the values. And remember, they're also the ones doing the assessment and paying the final assessed value. So there's a strong incentive to reduce the values. And you see regulations, to use the old Al Roth maxim, that sort of the types of rules that you see in the market suggest the types of behavior that's going on. You often see governments adopting rules on multipliers of assessed market value as thresholds. You have to pay at least 4 times the market value of the land in eminent domain actions. And there's sort of, you wouldn't expect to see a rule like that adopted if it were the case that the market value were sort of always a coherent number. But even so even if you believe that they were assessing market value perfectly, you still have a problem because the market value of the land might not be the value to the person currently holding it.
I was asking you an empirical question.
Yep.
Not a hypothetical.
Well, I mean, if you can take it for $100, and you can take it for $100, the market value is $100, right? I mean, if they can force you to sell for $100, that's what the price is.
That's not my question. Assessing
Right.
value, but it's probably, my guess is this is maybe not directly relevant to the stuff you want to tell us.
No.
Fair point.
I don't know. Scott held up this eminent domain as something that was, nefarious, and is it actually nefarious, or do people,
So there's,
I think it would be uncontroversial to say there are examples where it's nefarious.
yes, right. I think there are.
There's also
fact that it's
examples where
nefarious.
things going in actually has positive externality and so market value is higher because of the project.
Right.
So it's very complicated. And if you want
Correct.
to catalog empirical cases.
Yeah, so Drew's right. There are sometimes it has positive externalities, there are sometimes it has negative externalities. I think it's, clear that there have been some historical examples where there have been issues of this type, and certainly examples where people have protested and held out and later challenged the assessed values and won in court decisions that said that the assessed values by the government were far too low. Okay, so anyhow, holdout is very common. It's not just about land assembly, but you also see it when you're trying to do corporate acquisitions and have to collect all the shares, when you want to form patent pools, when you want to, say, reassemble spectrum, as the US government is currently seeking to do. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you that sort of a feature of these problems is that as the number of sellers that you have to aggregate complements from gets large, trade dries up. But meanwhile, there sort of hasn't been a lot of work thinking about different types of mechanisms for reducing holdout. There's eminent domain, different forms of takings, which exist a lot all over the world. And then the other one you see very commonly is voting-based procedures. Meanwhile, we've done a huge amount on auctions for substitutes. In some sense, these are auctions for complements. But we know that auctions for substitutes get very efficient when the number of agents gets large. This is an auspicious week for the talk, not just because the Iowa Senate just agreed that a 75% approval rate by individual sellers was necessary to trigger an eminent domain action for private acquisition. So they imposed a required voting mechanism over top of eminent domain, to allow it to be possible to trigger an eminent domain mechanism. But also The Economist covered a version of this story in India, where India's current land acquisition law is simultaneously too strict to pave the way for desirable projects and too lax to protect property owners. Forced land purchase requires the consent of 70% of affected landowners and must also pass a social impact test. And then compensation must be twice the market value for urban plots and 4 times that for rural land. So this is one of these settings where they've built a structure to try and protect the seller's interests because they don't think that the system can do it directly. But so consequently, you see these governments building sort of very complicated structures because their constituents demand changes to the law. You can't just take our land. But what they do is they build sort of more and more rules that restrict the types of development actions. And that's not necessarily efficient either, right? A lot of these large public projects we think have sort of large social value. But there's a hard backdrop, and the hard backdrop is that there's a very, very strong impossibility theorem due to Maleth and Postlewaite. So I'm going to set this up. There will be 3 sets of sort of very brief notation in the talk, but I will try and give the talk in such a fashion that if the notation is, if you drop the notation, you will still be able to follow it. But I'm going to give you a little bit of the notational guide so you can see it in the papers. We have a world with n agents. Each room has an individual value for some public project costing C of n. And this theorem is going to be stated in the public good provision world, and there's basically a dual theorem for takings. And the mechanism is going to give a probability with which the good is provided and a transfer rule. We're going to impose essentially very weak individual rationality and budget balance conditions. We're just going to ask for interim individual rationality and a form of self-financing constraint so that the project doesn't require external subsidies and expectation. And in a world with public values, this is extraordinarily easy to solve, right? If we know what everyone's values for their land are, and we know that the total value is greater than the total value is greater than the cost, we can just fund the project. We'll share the surplus somehow. This is sort of like the no credit constraints version of Yanku's talk. The Coase theorem holds, if you will. But things start to get very complicated once agents have private values, and this is going to look like the story I showed on the first slide. So the intuition, which I've just sequenced some beautiful sentences from the Meredith-Postlethwaite paper. So in order to provide the good, some agents have to contribute more than their minimum contribution, right? So if there's like some minimum level that we sort of publicly know is the lowest possible value someone could have, if the good costs a non-trivial amount, someone's got to be paying more than the minimum. But if everyone needs to agree, if the votes are goods are perfectly complementary, some agent can lower his or her contribution by announcing sort of my value for the good is low. So now if we're going to impose incentive compatibility, the only countervailing incentive is the possibility of pivotality. So you're only going to screw up the assembly or the public good if you're the pivotal guy who, by shading downwards, you cause it to the good not to be provided. But and this is sort of a standard one of these large market arguments. The probability that any individual agent is pivotal is very small, and so consequently, sort of every agent's basically got to be paying the minimal contribution in equilibrium, which means that no public projects are funded. Formally, if the agent's valuations are bounded above, so the aggregate value per individual of the project is bounded, and the cost is such that if all the agents have the minimal value, then the project doesn't go through, plus some distribution conditions, then the maximum probability that any individually rational, self-financing, and incentive-compatible mechanism can provide the good goes to 0. And so this is sort of the canonical holdout problem. It's a pretty strong impossibility theorem. And that's going to be the backdrop of sort of a general public goods story. I know the first time I ever talked with Jason about this space, he sort of said, well, it sounds to me like you're talking about a really hard public goods problem. Like, it's not about land assembly, it's public goods, and that's right. So everything, we're going to, Glenn's and Glenn's and my work, some of which is now joint with Jerry Green and Stephen Lally, has been thinking about land assembly because we think that's sort of the most interesting market design application, but all of this can also be thought about in sort of a general public goods world. So I've given you the basic framing and the intuition for the theorem. In the interest of time, I'm not going to attempt to prove it on the board. It's a lot of probability inequality chasing, but it's very intuitive. I will give you 2 more sort of quick cuts that hopefully make this feel really concrete once we get to land assembly. All right, so that's the first phase of the talk. It's sort of end chapter 1. And warning, I'm going to slightly change notation. Again, I'm keeping notation to the minimum, but trying to be at the same time consistent with the individual papers I'm quoting from so that you can go and look at them if you want. Yeah?
So how important is self-financing in that impossibility result?
So for sure it's important. This is sort of, in all of these settings, we know we can subsidize efficiency. But in some sense, for real-world design, it's not clear how much we can. But sort of we know this going back to Myers and Satterthwaite, sort of the bilateral bargaining inefficiency you can address by inserting a sufficient subsidy. It's going to be sort of the same type of story here. Yep.
The one thing I would add is that it's more violated here than it is in Myers and Satterthwaite because you have to subsidize all the way down to that minimum value for everyone.
That's true. Yeah.
In the limit at least.
That's right.
So whereas Myers and Satterthwaite, you could get very close by just subsidizing for one
Because the
person.
result was just not fully efficient. So the
Yeah.
system was 1 minus steps on efficiency, whereas the
Right.
also
Yeah, that's right.
really.
You can't get away from the status quo at all.
That's right.
How important is the independence assumption?
How important is the independence assumption? So where is it? Sorry, it's back here. Yeah, so you can add correlations. You can get it to the point. So I guess two functional comments on this. Sort of same thing. You can add some amount of correlation, and you can actually get to the point at which it's common knowledge that the project should be funded, even though in equilibrium it still never gets funded.
There are no ways of sort of modifying Crimea-MacLean to solve the problem?
Yeah, it's basically my question. Yeah.
I do not know the answer. Glenn, do you know off the top of your head?
I mean, I'm not sure, but I would be pretty confident there's some Crimmer-MacLean thing that'll work. I mean, yeah, I don't know how much you buy into that sort of thing.
Okay, so the answer is, so this is good. The set of open questions was going to contain a subset of different mailing post-await modifications. No, Crimmer. So one possibility is possibly modifying some form of
Well,
Crimmer-MacLean.
Here's a question. Does anyone know if you can do Crimmer-MacLean to solve the Meyerson-Satterthwaite problem?
So it's certain. So the Crimmer-MacLean, if you think about how the construction works, it takes away the private value problem completely.
Yeah, but the problem is you face budget balancing constraint here. So that's the thing that I wasn't completely clear about. What do you mean?
Crimmer-MacLean's budget can be budget
Yeah, it can be
balanced.
budget balanced, I think, right?
No, but that's the simple selling problem, right? Here,
But if you can solve it in Meyerson-Satterthwaite, you should be able to solve it here.
It's ex ante budget balance. If that's what you care about, then yes.
yeah, ex ante is easy. Ex ante is easy.
And that's all we've imposed here, right? So this is just ex ante self-finance, which is weaker. Okay, so seems plausible you could do this. I don't know that anybody's done it. Second thing is sort of as you make the set of goods you want to assemble a little bit less complicated. We'll talk at the end about. Yep.
You're saying mail it postally.
Yeah, they're only asking for ex ante self-finance.
Yeah, I mean, they're showing a bad result.
We're showing a bad result, right?
So that's
So,
a
like,
good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, if it may be that you can even have ex post, but still solve it. But you may or may not be able to solve it with the Cramer-MacLean if it's ex post. I don't know.
I see. Yeah, that's true.
Anyway, it doesn't matter.
That's right. Okay. What was it? Oh, so then the other thing to think about here, we'll talk at the end about what what Glenn and I have been calling combinatorial holdout. Sort of when you don't have to get every single good, but maybe you have to get some contiguous collection, say in a in a big graph or something. You maybe need two of them, and you can pick any two that are connected along some series of edges. Unclear sort of what the appropriate trade-off between levels of substitutability and complementarity for trying to break these types of impossibility theorems look like. Okay. So, in interest of time, I'm going to change notation if we have no further ALF post-await questions. Cool. And so now we're going to enter a world of land assembly. We're going to imagine, again, we have n agents. Each of them has a valuation for his land. And there's going to be sort of one person who's a prospective buyer who has a value for the aggregate plot. And we'll assume that there is some uncertainty about whether the buyer actually should be buying, right? So it's the case that the buyer's value is bounded above by the maximum possible value of everybody. So the valuations in the Maleth post-await world here are going to be the difference between what an individual seller gets in the case of sale. So some fraction of B, or some fraction of an offer O, and the valuation, right? Because that's the value you get if the assembly is provided. It's the difference between what you get from the buyer and what you lose by giving up your land. So that's essentially the only relabeling we're going to do in this round. Jason? No?
Sorry, the agent's values, if there's no trade, is DI.
Correct.
And if there is a trade, they get paid money.
Yep.
And they get a fraction of.
Yeah, so we're going to imagine, so they get some amount of money. So for now we'll call it T, and later it's going to be some specific fraction. So you get some transfer TI, and you lose VI because you give up your land. And so this is your value in the case that the good is provided. So this is what we were calling, this is what we were calling VI previously in the mail with postal weight paper. So apologies, that's the notation relabeling. Again, a mechanism will specify the probability that the transfer occurs, and will specify some sort of individual payment rule. And now we can re-invoke the theorem we just discussed to show that any individually rational, self-financing, and incentive-compatible mechanism is actually going to have no assembly in the limit as the number of sellers gets large. Intuition in just coming out of the land assembly world, again, goes back to this first slide. So we can imagine two sort of very extreme mechanisms. One of them is each seller names her own price. Well, now each one has very small impact on the outcome, and so they have an incentive to shade their reported value up, right? I'm unlikely to be pivotal, so I want to name, oh gosh, I want so much money in order to sell my land. Or take it or leave it offers to each seller. Again, sort of there's some fixed probability that each one is accepted, and so assembly is going to occur with a vanishingly small probability in the limit. And so regardless of the mechanism, complementarity is going to kill all the assembly, even if we know with very high probability. So even if this, the buyer's value is actually very high in expectation relative to the expected value of the plot. Sorry, the expected aggregate seller value for the plot. And so to try and do market design, we have to weaken a couple of different goals. So in earlier work, which we're now sort of revising in a way I'll describe in a second, we talked in particular about weakening the efficiency criterion to go for what we're calling bilateral efficiency. We sort of want to separate out the bargains with the individual sellers and replace them with a single bargain between the buyer and the community of sellers. And then we're going to have the sellers, sort of make a collective decision among themselves about whether to accept the offer. So we want sort of as much efficiency as you could get in a bilateral bargain between the single buyer and a collective seller that represents the community. So in particular, in these situations where it's certain with very high probability that the transfer should occur, we want to capture that. Secondarily, yep.
You're just saying that you want to be as efficient as Myers and Satterthwaite.
Correct, exactly. We want to push up against the Myers and Satterthwaite bound to the greatest extent possible. Secondarily, we'd also like to make it the case that inefficient trade is not going to occur. So it's not going to be the case that the community ever gets robbed of its land in some very inefficient way. In some sense, the community gets a collective veto. This will, in some sense, the bilateral efficiency thing is going to be the main component. We're going to get very close to the second condition as well as we get there. Additionally, we're sort of going to want some sort of Lindahl-like sharing rule. And then we've worked with different versions of sort of trying to maintain approximate forms of individual rationality.
Explain what Lindahl is. Does everyone know what Lindahl is? I don't think the...
What's Lindahl, Scott?
Glenn, you're going to give a much better intuitive explanation.
Okay, so Lindahl is you try to get as close as possible to satisfying people's IR constraints subject to information that you have. So we know from mail-out postal weight that you can't actually satisfy people's IR constraints, but imagine that the buyer has some information that the social planner doesn't have that tells him what the distribution of seller values are. You want him to do, at least in some sense, the best that he can given his information at satisfying everyone's IR constraints.
I sort of think about it as being kind of like...
None of that was a definition of Lindahl.
No, it wasn't a definition of Lindahl.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's, in this context, it's a definition of Lindahl, right?
I got confused because I thought it was the IC constraint that was a problem, not the IR constraint.
It's both.
Both.
So this says nothing about an IC constraint?
No, this is just talking about this one criterion here.
Yeah, this is just about...
The Lindahl criterion in a general says that people should be forced to pay a fraction of the fraction of the cost in a public project that they pay is equal to their fraction of the value in that public project. So like,
Right,
it-
sort of it's like a proportional sharing type story.
yeah. And so here, it's saying that the,
Meaning, in this example where you've got a combinatorial value and you could have a solution without that?
and just
So
think
this
about
is,
the
right now we're
public-
assuming, we haven't allowed combinatorial splitting yet. So this is just full complementarity. Yeah. So we don't know, so incidentally,
So in your first example with 2 through 9 and then 1, so what's a Lindell allocation?
It's one in which.
yeah, it's one in which everyone shares in proportion to the return from their value.
Yeah.
There's a fixed sum of money that all the buyers are getting, and we're going to allocate it off, take the weight you get as your value divided by sum of values. Take that
Right, so like-
multiplier times the total payment.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, got it, yeah.
Cool.
So, Scott, how do you define closeness?
So this is
That's what we're still.
this
trying
is
to
in
figure
progress.
out.
We're still trying to come up with still trying to understand the correct notion of closeness. So the yep.
Is this fairness guarantee something that you started off wanting, or is this a question of this is a property your desired mechanism has anyway, and you're sticking your name on it to make it?
No, so actually, so this type of fairness property is something we started off wanting years ago.
Okay.
Like we wanted a rule of sharing that in some fashion compensates people based on aggregate information that's available about their values. Sort of in
For
yeah,
political economy reasons or moral reasons? I mean, what's
Is it trivial without the condition?
trivial without this condition. No, because we still have to elicit values. Political economy or moral reasons.
I would say mostly political economy.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about what causes like these projects to get held up, in many cases, even when the government has allegedly the coercive authority to take it, it's the fact that a lot of people are protesting. If you have something where you can convincingly say no one is likely to do much worse than they're doing right now, you're unlikely to run into those types of problems. If you read the accounts of Robert Moses' attempt to remake New York City, a huge amount was about these sorts of IR constraint violations. So, yeah.
Glenn, I appreciate your ability to always have an excellent quote from history. That's quite cool. Good. And the last thing we'd like, and I'm going to not even spend 20 seconds on this because we're very short on time, and this is also fairly conjectural as to how we can link it in with our proposed solutions, but this one, we'd like to have sort of good ex-ante investment incentives. So a lot of the literature on, the early literature on land assembly is about how your different takings rules affect people's incentives to invest in their land. Are they going to build the efficient projects and things like that? So Glenn and I have an old paper which is now being, heavily rebuilt. But the basic idea of this paper was to split, sort of, as I said, the buyer's negotiation with the community away from the negotiation among the sellers. And so the story is basically that we're going to imagine that a buyer makes an offer for the collective plot. The sellers are going to use a collective choice procedure to decide whether to accept that offer. And then in the case of sale, the sellers are going to divide that offer according to some fixed share rule, which you could imagine is sort of exogenous about sort of externally observable information about their land, or the buyer could just specify it. This is how I intend to divide the goods. But of course, so then the next underlying question is sort of what's the choice of collective choice procedure? And if you've been following my co-author lately, you probably already have a conjecture about what we're talking about. We've been thinking about the incentives created by using a version of quadratic voting, in which sellers are going to buy in in their collective decision, some number of votes, pay quadratic costs, and we can redistribute those costs, incidentally, again with respect to these share rules if we wanted. So we can sort of, so we can balance the budget, and at the same time, you're sort of providing the sellers to express their intensity of preferences, which in some sense is part of what you'd actually want to do, right? If you want to learn about the guy who really, really wants to live on this house that his family's lived on for 3 generations, you're going to learn about that through the mechanism. And so there's been a lot of work on the efficiency of quadratic voting. A lot of work. There's been some recent excellent work and in a bunch of different settings on the efficiency of quadratic voting in large markets. Here, there's sort of this additional wrinkle, which is that the buyer is going to adjust the offer in equilibrium. Right? So it's not just we're just deciding as a community about a single collective decision, but we're deciding about a collective decision that's a function of the buyer's offer. And so it's actually important to figure out, and this is why we're not done. This is sort of lots and lots of stuff in progress. It's important to figure out exactly how the buyer's offer moves in adjustment with the equilibrium decision. But we still think we're going to get very close to efficiency, and it's going to be a lot like this bilateral bargaining efficiency we're looking for. Yes?
It looks like the ordering of events has the voting happen after the offer is known.
Yeah.
And you just were
Yep.
talking about how people adjust their votes because the offer's not known, and so I'm confused.
Sorry, it sounds like I misspoke. The buyer's offer is what adjusts in equilibrium. That's the additional thing. It's not the seller.
Yeah.
So the buyer will make an offer that if he's very certain that there's a lot of surplus, like if he thinks he knows the community's expected value, he'll shade his bid down.
Yes.
Right? And so we basically need is for those things not to get close too quickly. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Yes.
Why is, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Sorry.
S sub I is a notation that's used on this slide. I don't remember seeing it before.
Sorry, it was there. Shares. So these are going to be some sharing rule. Could be exogenously determined from sort of, objective characteristics of land. Like if we sort of, as a normative rule, decide that we want to evaluate land as a function of total size, these could be people's relative fractions of the total plot. Could also be just, a shorthand for the way the buyer chooses to propose dividing the offer.
Okay, but it's not allowed, for example, to be a function of Ri. So
Correct. Yes.
Voting on whether to accept the offer is independent of what the shares
Yes,
are going.
that's right.
So what is it about this collective decision procedures that violates the assumptions, constraints of the mail as postal right for you to hope to get a different result?
So what is it about? So a bunch.
What are you relaxing? I guess.
Yeah.
Violation is a too strong word.
Well, so we're relaxing to some extent all of the different pieces, right? So it's the case that your land might be taken, even if you personally even if it's not individually rational for you.
I see.
Right,
So individual rationality is relaxed.
Right. There's some relaxation of individual rationality, and there's some relaxation of incentive compatibility as well, because in equilibrium, you're not going to buy quite to represent your exact preference. We're sort of, it's a simultaneous relaxation of most of it. And then I guess also, well, yeah, so and then mail-if postal weight has zero efficiency, so we're going to get some amount of efficiency, which we think is very close to this bilateral efficiency bound.
Just a
Yep.
clarification, how should I think about the vote Ri? So what does it represent?
Intensity of preference? Do you have a favorite way to
It's the number of
speak of
votes
this?
you buy. You
Right.
can choose any number of votes you want to buy.
Yeah, but I
And you
thought,
pay the square of the number of votes that you buy.
but I thought you were
So
asking.
I can buy negative, because it is asking.
That's
so-
just being
Could be-
opposed.
That means you're voting against.
You're voting against the.
Okay.
Yes, sorry. Apologies, I didn't understand your question. I thought there was like how do you interpret your choice of votes? That's right. It could be negative. You can vote against.
One literature question.
Yeah.
Has anybody sort of studied a problem like this where buyer makes an offer first, and then they vote on the decision somehow, given some sharing rule? So when you look at some sort of supermajority rule, simple majority rule, and things like that.
Interesting.
You're saying what? They vote on the...
Yeah. So,
Yeah, just
so
like
the
just-
standard voting procedure
Yeah.
instead of a
Yeah.
quadratic.
Oh no, that's a very canonical mechanism. It's been used all over the world. It's
But have
obviously
examples
Has
manipulable.
anybody written the
Have people
mechanism design
analyze
paper?
what happens there?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes, we will have. In particular in the context of strategic takeovers of firms, you're making offers and you need to get a board to vote to agree. So Julia Iraslan's done some work on this, Mehmet Ekmekci. These are just some recent political economy folks who've done it.
Yeah, but I mean, the real problem with that mechanism is that, especially if you can tailor the offers across people, you have an obvious incentive to concentrate the offers on a majority
Right.
group.
immediately let people do that. Here, the seller makes the offer, you have fixed share, and we don't have to.
So one answer is that, like, you know, you actually want, if the buyer has information that can help bring it closer to a
Yeah, for
Lindahl
sure.
allocation, for them to have an incentive to incorporate that information into the shares. And to the extent, or you would even want to ideally give them some incentive to invest in acquiring that information. And under quadratic voting, there will be some incentive to do that.
So the shares here, SI, the buyer doesn't get to pick the shares.
Well, no, so the buyer could. So they could be just purely based on exogenous, like pure publicly observable information, or it could be that the buyer has some information about what the right shit rate
And our
could be.
proposal is that the buyer does get to choose them.
Right.
I missed that. I thought
But we can allow the buyer to choose them. We don't insist upon it, but it's a feature that we could allow.
Is there an intuition for this weird term in the payment, which is the one that's not RI squared?
That's redistribution. That's proportional redistribution. So this inflates everybody's payment fraction. So this is SI over 1 minus SJ is your share of Mr. J's payment.
So then the thing is split according to SI, but then these redistributions are also transfers too, so.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so we are functionally over time, so I'm going to just talk about what the combinatorial holdout model is instead of trying to talk in a lot of detail about it. And try and do that in about, I don't know.
3 minutes?
What?
3 minutes?
I was going to say 2, so. Good. Right. So imagine a world where there's some form of competition and some form of complementarity. So think about some number of components partitioned into different clusters, with competition within clusters and competition across clusters. Or competition across clusters. And so here we did, in this short AER papers and proceedings paper, Glenn and I did this very, very simple sort of first order analysis, just asking, if you make a take it or leave it offer, that guarantees that you assemble an individual component with probability p, how does competition within different clusters differ from competition across? And so it turns out that there's actually quite a significant difference. So competition within clusters actually mitigates holdout. So in large enough markets, the fact that you need to buy one of a number of substitutes within an individual cluster makes you pretty well off. Looks a lot like buying substitutes, but competition across clusters doesn't. Sort of the idea that your ability to buy lines up so that you get all of the components within an individual cluster. It's very hard to do that. So if there's substitutability across clusters, but complementarity within, you get back to the holdout problem we've just been describing, at least for this simple type of mechanism. We don't, as I said, we haven't done any sort of super fancy analysis of other classes of mechanisms. But even sort of this just very simple analysis shows you that there is a problem here. We also sort of thought only about very, very, very simple types of complementarity and substitutability structures, right? The fact that there's a partition of clusters makes the world pretty easy. As we know that there are real-world problems that look kind of like this, the spectrum reassembly program is a good example, where there they have the additional dimension that they can repack people. They can sort of force people to move around. And with farmers and land, you might imagine that too. I need to build an airport. I need a set of 10 of these farms that are adjacent to each other, but I could move people to other farms if I wanted. There's a lot of space there where we don't know all the different options. In related but different spaces, there's a bunch of work on sequential assemblies of different types. There's an old game theory literature where you have to acquire goods in sequence. And they show, that shockingly, there's a large amount of holdout when you get towards the end of the sequence. We sort of, you might think about being able to do approximation type mechanisms and understand sort of exactly how big the loss is from poor choices of order and things like that on average. Beyond that, sort of to riff off of the 2 earlier stories, we can also imagine in any of these situations splitting the property rights between the buyers and the sellers ex ante. Right here, we've sort of given a lot of it to the sellers, but we know that in general, sort of somewhere in the middle is often right. And then, of course, we could add budget constraints, right? So if you're going to be running something like a collective choice mechanism, you're always worried about running things like VCG because people can hit massive budget constraints. And in the real world with sellers, with land being taken with eminent domain, that's a real issue. These guys are often pretty impoverished.
By the way, now I have a better answer to the Kremer-McLean question.
Excellent.
Because I looked it up in the Mail-Off Postal White Paper. So it is actually a little bit more subtle than just Kremer-McLean solves the problem. So the reason is, so Kremer-McLean does solve the problem if you can have unbounded payments and people are
Yeah.
perfectly risk neutral.
Right.
However, it does not, what they prove is that any bounded payment mechanism suffers
Yeah.
the same problem. And if there's even a little bit of risk aversion, the problem persists. That's not true in the substitutes environment. So in the substitutes environment, there's a recent paper by McLean and Postlethwaite that shows that when you have substitutes, you can get the solution for actually arbitrarily small bounds on payments. So there's some sense in which the Kremer-McLean problem can solve it here, but only in its sort of like worst and most implausible form, whereas in the substitutes environment, you can get arbitrarily tight bounds on the amount and arbitrarily small amounts of risk aversion.
I mean, Kramer-Klein always has that.
That's not true. That's what
don't think
McLean
that's
and
true.
Postlethwaite showed, that while the easiest construction has that function, there are ways to achieve the same thing using arbitrarily small payments. That's not in the original Kremer-McLean paper, but that's what they have a recent T paper showing that.
Really?
Yeah.
Arbitrarily small expected payments or exposed?
Exposed. They have, that's only in the limit as the number of people gets large in a substitutes environment.
Yeah. Information is more.
So they have to be
Right, so
informationally
the-
small.
the
The
component
problem
of
is that
each
they're
one is
getting
small.
informationally
Yeah.
large here, whereas they're
Yeah.
getting informationally small in the other
Information
environment.
is
and
small.
so-
Fix that two-guy Kramer.
No, you can't.
No.
No, I agree. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
QED?